Welcome to our channel. Where are you watching from? I never thought a dinner could flip my life like a coin, but there I was, plate half full, hearing my daughter hiss across the table like a snake. "Dad, don't eat here. You embarrass me." And the room folded into a silence so loud it felt like a slap. I left the table like a ghost, palms slick, heart thudding like a bad drum, and I walked to the kitchen not because I wanted to hide, but because I needed air. Because the humiliation burned a hole through my chest, and I needed to breathe somewhere. That didn't have her eyes on me. And in the kitchen the light was harsh, the sink full of dishes, the radio playing some old song that used to mean something to us, and on the counter, half under a stack of mail, I saw the papers. Messy, folded, the kind of papers that don't belong in a family home unless secrets are being kept. I picked them up with hands that didn't feel like mine and read names and numbers and messages that made my stomach drop. There were texts printed out, bank statements, a letter with a lawyer's stamp, and a list of dates that matched nights I thought she was at a friend's. And for a second the world narrowed to ink on paper and the sound of my own breathing. I felt like I was watching myself from outside, a man in a cheap shirt reading the script of his own life being rewritten. The first thing that hit me wasn't anger. It was a cold, slow grief. The kind that sits in your bones and rearranges the furniture of your memory. I remembered teaching her to tie her shoes, the way she used to fall asleep on my chest, the way she called me dad like it was a small miracle. And then the other side of the coin flashed, betrayal. The raw, ugly kind that makes you question every laugh, every late-night call, every "I'm fine" that might have been a lie. I wanted to scream, to tear the house apart, to make her feel the same smallness she had put me in at the table. But there was also this other voice, quieter, older, that said, "Don't be the kind of man who ruins, lives because he's hurt." That voice made me fold the papers back up and slide them into the drawer like a secret I wasn't ready to own. But secrets don't stay hidden. They breathe, they leak. Over the next days I watched her like a detective watches a suspect, noticing the way she avoided my gaze, the way she laughed too loud at nothing, the way her phone buzzed, and she moved like a cat guarding something fragile. I thought about exposing her, about printing the messages and dropping them where everyone would see, about calling the people on those lists and asking questions that would make her world tilt. I imagined the satisfaction, the sharp, clean taste of revenge, but I also imagined the fallout. Her face when she realized I had been the one to pull the thread, the way her life would unravel in public, the kids at school whispering, the neighbors pointing. I thought about my own father and how he used to say that the measure of a man is how he treats those who can do nothing for him, and I realized that if I destroyed her now, I'd be destroying the last thing that tied me to my better self. So I did something else. I sat her down at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd told me to leave, and I put the papers between us like a dare. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I told her I had found things that didn't add up, and I asked her to tell me the truth. She looked at me like I was a stranger, like the man who had once been her hero had been replaced by someone who could read receipts and bank statements. For a long time she said nothing, and then the dam broke. She told me about mistakes, about a man who had promised her the world and given her bills and threats, about a fear that had made her lie and hide and push me away because she thought she was protecting me from shame. She cried in a way that made me feel both relief and a new kind of hurt, the hurt of knowing how close I'd been to losing her to my own pride. We argued. We slammed doors we sat in. Silence until the house felt like a boat in a storm, but slowly, like a tide, something shifted. I didn't forgive her in a single breath. Forgiveness is a long road paved with small acts. I started by not telling anyone, by not weaponizing the papers, by helping her call the lawyer whose name was on the letter, and by sitting in the waiting room while she signed forms that would protect her. I paid for a counselor because I could see the way her shoulders carried weight that wasn't hers to carry, and I learned to listen without trying to fix everything with a lecture. There were nights when I wanted to remind her of the humiliation she had caused me, to make her feel the sting of that dinner. But every time the urge rose, I thought of the little girl who used to fall asleep on my chest, and I swallowed the words. The truth is messy. The truth is not a weapon. It's a bridge if you let it be. We rebuilt in fits and starts, like two people learning to walk again after a fall. She learned to tell me when she was scared instead of hiding, and I learned to ask without accusing. People in the neighborhood noticed the change, and some of them whispered that I was soft, that I should have taught her a lesson, but I knew something they didn't. The thing that would have satisfied my pride would have cost me my daughter. In the end, the papers that could have ruined her life became the thing that saved it, because they forced us to face what we had been avoiding. I don't pretend it's all fixed. There are scars, and there are nights when I wake up and replay that hiss like a broken record. But there is also a new rhythm in the house, a quieter, truer beat. I tell this not to make myself a hero or a saint, but because I want anyone watching to know that humiliation can be a doorway, not a sentence, and that sometimes the hardest thing a man can do is choose love over revenge. The papers on the counter didn't just sit there. They breathed like something alive, like a secret with lungs. And when I picked them up that night, the house felt suddenly too small for the truth, like the walls were leaning in to listen. I remember the way the light from the overhead bulb made the ink look wet, like it could smear if I touched it wrong. And I remember thinking, for the first time in a long time, that I didn't know my own daughter at all, that the person who had hissed at me across the table was a stranger wearing her face. And that realization hit harder than the humiliation had. Because humiliation is loud and quick, and then it's over. But this was slow and cold, and it settled into my bones. So I did what men do when they don't know how to feel. I started to look for answers, quietly, like a thief in my own home, and I told myself I was being practical, that I needed to know what I was dealing with before I reacted, but the truth was uglier. I wanted to catch her in a lie so I could throw it back at her and watch her shrink, to make her understand how small she'd made me feel. And that thought made me ashamed even as it burned, because there was a part of me that loved the idea of being the one who could fix things with a single blow, the old-school dad who sets the world straight with a stern word. But the papers kept whispering otherwise. They were full of names and dates and transactions that didn't add up, messages that read like a map of someone else's life stitched into hers. And the more I read, the more the map led me away from revenge and towards something I hadn't expected. Fear, not for myself, but for her. A fear that she was tangled in something that could swallow her whole if I pulled the wrong thread. So I folded the papers back into the drawer and I watched. And watching felt like a betrayal and like protection at the same time. Like standing at the edge of a cliff with a hand on the small of her back, unsure whether to push or to pull her back. And every time her phone buzzed, I felt my pulse spike like a cheap drum. Every time she laughed too loud, I cataloged it like evidence. And every time she looked at me, I saw a flicker of guilt and something else. Panic, maybe, or shame, or the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a secret heavy enough to break you. And I started to piece together a timeline in my head. Nights she said she was with friends that matched dates on the statements, calls at odd hours, that matched names on the printed messages, and a lawyer's letter that smelled like trouble, like a storm on the horizon. And I thought about how easy it would be to drop those papers into the right hands and watch the dominoes fall, to make her regret that hiss in front of the whole world. But then I thought about the little things, her crooked grin when she was 7, the way she used to hide my keys in the freezer because she thought it was funny, the way she called me at 2 in the morning, when she couldn't sleep and wanted someone to tell her a dumb story. And I couldn't bring myself to be the man who burned that bridge for sport, so I did the other thing. I became quiet and patient, and, God help me, I became a liar for her, telling myself I was buying time when really I was buying myself a chance to be better than my worst instinct. And that was the beginning of a new kind of war, one fought in whispers and in the small, careful choices that make up a life, because the papers didn't just threaten her. They threatened the family we had been pretending to be. And if I exposed her without knowing the whole picture, I would be the one to tear it apart. So I started to follow the edges of the truth like a man tracing a scar, asking questions that sounded casual, checking accounts that I had no business checking, calling numbers and pretending to be a concerned neighbor until I heard voices that didn't belong in our house. And every answer opened another door, and behind each door there was more mess. A man with a smooth voice who said all the right things and left all the wrong marks, a debt that had been growing like mold in the dark, threats that smelled like desperation, and a pattern of hiding that made sense in a way that made my stomach drop, because it wasn't just about lies. It was about survival. And suddenly my daughter's hiss at dinner felt like a cracked mirror reflecting something I couldn't bear to look at. So I stopped cataloging her faults and started cataloging the danger. And that shift changed everything. It made me less interested in punishment and more interested in protection. And protection meant learning to be quiet when my gut wanted to roar. It meant sitting in the passenger seat while she drove to meetings I didn't understand and pretending not to notice the way her hands trembled on the wheel. It meant letting her keep some dignity even as I pulled strings behind the scenes, calling in favors from people I hadn't spoken to in years, showing up at a courthouse with a face that said nothing and a wallet that said everything, and watching her sign papers that would keep her safe while I felt like a ghost in my own life. Because the man who used to think strength was a raised voice was learning that strength could be a steady presence, a quiet hand on the back of someone who is falling apart. And that lesson came with a price. Nights of sleeplessness, mornings where I couldn't eat, the slow erosion of the easy arrogance that had kept me comfortable for decades. But there were moments of grace too, small, ridiculous things that felt like miracles. Like the night she left a note on the fridge that said thanks in handwriting that looked like mine, or the way she let me make coffee for her without rolling her eyes. And those moments were like oxygen. They kept me from suffocating under the weight of what we'd found. And still the papers sat in the drawer like a sleeping animal, and I knew they would wake eventually. That secrets don't stay buried forever. And so I started to plan not for revenge, but for a reveal that would protect her and not destroy her. A way to take the power out of those messages and put it where it belonged, into truth and into safety. And as I worked, I felt something else grow in me, a stubborn tenderness that surprised me, because I had always thought tenderness was for soft men, and I was not a soft man. But tenderness is not weakness. It's a choice, and I chose it, even when it hurt, even when the urge to make her feel small rose like bile in my throat. I swallowed it down and let the tenderness guide me. And by the time the week turned and the lawyer called back and the first domino fell in a way that didn't ruin her, I realized the papers had done something I hadn't expected. They had forced me to become the kind of father I had only pretended to be, and that realization was both a relief and a wound, because becoming better doesn't erase the past. It just makes you responsible for the future. And as I closed the drawer that night, I felt the house breathe with me, like it had been holding its breath for weeks. And I knew the next move would be the hardest yet, because secrets that breathe always want to be heard. And when they finally speak, the whole world listens. The kitchen light hummed like an old refrigerator, and the silence after that hiss at dinner felt like a living thing, heavy and patient. And I found myself standing there in the doorway watching my daughter move through the house, like someone carrying a secret too hot to touch. And I realized in a way that made my chest ache that silence can be louder than any insult, because it fills the room with questions that have no answers yet. I remember the exact sound of her voice when she said it. Sharp, small, like a blade. And how it cut through the ordinary clatter of plates and conversation and left me raw. So raw that I went to the kitchen to be alone, and the light over the sink turned the world into a stage where every shadow looked guilty. And there on the counter the papers had already started their slow work of unspooling the life I thought I knew. And the long silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of things I couldn't name at first. Regret, fear, a kind of stunned disbelief. That your child could look at you and choose shame over love. And I stood there with my hands on the cool laminate and felt the house breathe around me like it was waiting for me to decide whether to break or to hold. And the decision felt enormous, like choosing which bridge to burn when both sides have people you love on them. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I listened to the silence until it told me what it needed to. And what it needed was not a spectacle, but a reckoning, not a public shaming, but a private truth. And that truth came out in fits and starts over the next days in the way she avoided eye contact, in the way she left the room when the phone rang, in the way she flinched at the sound of my keys. And each little thing was a breadcrumb trail that led me deeper into a story I hadn't wanted to be part of, a story with a man who had been smooth and persuasive, and a ledger of debts and threats that smelled like danger. And the kitchen light became my confessional, where I sat with the papers spread out like a map of her mistakes and my own failures. Because I had missed the signs, I had been the kind of dad who assumed everything was fine until it wasn't. And that realization hit me harder than the hiss ever did. Because humiliation is a quick burn, but ignorance is a slow poison. And I had been drinking it for years without knowing. So the long silence taught me to pay attention to the small things. The way she chewed her lip when she was nervous, the way she lied about being late because she didn't want to drag me into her mess, the way she tried to protect me by pushing me away. And those small things added up to a pattern that made my blood run cold. And I felt both furious and helpless at once. Furious at the person who had taken advantage of her, and helpless because I couldn't undo the choices she'd made. But I also felt something else, a stubborn love that made me want to fix things without breaking her. And that was the hardest part. Learning to be strategic with my heart, to hold my anger in reserve and use it only when it would protect rather than punish. Because revenge is easy and ruin is permanent. And I wasn't willing to trade my daughter's future for a moment of satisfaction. So I started to move like a man who had learned to be quiet and careful, calling people I hadn't spoken to in years, sitting in waiting rooms with my jaw clenched while she signed papers that would keep her safe, learning to be a presence, without being a hammer. And the kitchen light watched me do it like a witness that had seen too much to be fooled by theatrics. And in that light, I learned to ask questions that didn't sound like accusations, to offer help without making her feel small, to be a father who could hold both the pain of betrayal and the work of repair at the same time. And that balancing act was brutal and beautiful in equal measure, because it forced me to grow up in ways I hadn't expected, to trade the old macho scripts for something quieter and harder. Patience, humility, the willingness to be wrong, and to say so, and the willingness to let her lead when she needed to, even if it bruised my pride. And there were nights when the silence returned, and I would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold and replay the dinner in my head, imagining all the ways I could have struck back, all the ways I could have made her feel the same smallness she had given me. And each imagined revenge tasted like ash. So I pushed it down and chose instead to be useful, to be steady, to be the kind of man who shows up even when it's ugly. And slowly, like a wound that scabs over, things began to shift, not because I waved a magic wand, but because we did the slow, boring work of being honest, and of setting boundaries, and of calling in help when we needed it. And the kitchen lights saw those small victories. A phone call answered without panic, a meeting attended without trembling, a laugh that wasn't forced. And those tiny things felt like oxygen after a long dive, and I learned to celebrate them without making them into trophies. Because recovery is not a highlight reel. It's a series of small, steady steps that add up to something real. And the long silence taught me to be present for those steps, to notice them, to hold them like fragile things. And in doing so, I found a new kind of pride that wasn't about being right or being respected in public, but about being the kind of father who could be trusted when the world got messy. And that trust is a currency that buys you more than any public vindication ever could. And so the kitchen light, which had once felt like an interrogation lamp, became a lamp of witness, a place where we could sit and talk without the theater of dinner guests or the pressure of performance. And in that light, we rebuilt a language of honesty, of small apologies, of practical help, and of the occasional stupid joke that made us both roll our eyes and laugh. And the long silence that had once been a threat became a space where we could breathe and choose again. And I learned that silence isn't always an enemy. Sometimes it's a teacher that forces you to listen to the things you were too proud to hear. And if I had to choose between being right and being present, I'd choose presence every time, because presence keeps people alive. And in the end, that's what mattered more than any wounded ego or public spectacle. That my daughter was still here, that we were still a family in the messy, imperfect way families are, and that the kitchen light would keep humming while we learned how to live with the truth. The ink on those papers felt like a second skin, like a language that had been written over the life I thought I knew. And when I unfolded the pages under the kitchen light, I realized memory is not a single thing, but a stack of fragile sheets that can be smudged, torn, or rewritten by someone with a pen and a motive. I remember the first time I saw the handwriting. Neat, practiced, the kind of script that belongs to people who make promises and keep receipts for them. And my stomach dropped. Because the dates matched nights I had tucked her in, because the names matched men I had met at barbecues and thought harmless, and because the messages read like a ledger of favors owed and favors taken. And in that moment, I felt like a man who had been reading a book in a language he thought he understood only to discover whole chapters had been swapped out. And the betrayal wasn't just hers or theirs. It was mine too, for not seeing, for not asking, for letting the easy rhythms of our life lull me into a belief that love was enough to shield us from the world. And the more I read, the more the past rearranged itself into a new story where my daughter was not the child I had raised, but a person who had been making choices under pressure I hadn't imagined. And that realization made me furious and tender at the same time, a dangerous mix that felt like gasoline and water in the same jar. Because fury wanted to burn everything down and tenderness wanted to patch the roof and keep the rain out. And I had to choose which impulse would define me. So I sat there with the papers and let the ink do its work, letting the facts sink in like cold water. And as they sank, I started to remember things differently. The nights she came home late and said she was studying, the times she refused to let me meet certain friends, the way she flinched when a certain song came on the radio. All those small details that had seemed like quirks now read like footnotes to a larger, darker chapter. And I felt the weight of every missed sign like a debt I owed to myself and to her. Because being a father isn't just about showing up for graduations and games. It's about noticing the quiet changes, the slow shifts in posture and tone that whisper when something is wrong. And I had been deaf to those whispers until the ink forced me to listen. And listening hurt in a way that made me want to lash out, to make someone pay for the nights my daughter had been scared enough to hide. But I also knew that lashing out would be a coward's way to feel powerful, and power taken that way is hollow and dangerous. So I did something I had never done before. I let the ink teach me how to be patient, how to gather evidence, not to weaponize it, but to understand the shape of the danger. And that meant learning to read between the lines, to see not just what was written, but what was missing, the silences that spoke louder than the words, the gaps where explanations should have been, and in those gaps I found fear, her fear, not mine. And that changed the calculus, because when you see fear in the person who hurt you, revenge becomes a poor currency, and protection becomes the only honest response. So I folded the papers carefully and put them in a place where they wouldn't be lost, but wouldn't be used as a club, and then I started to act like a man who had been given a second chance to do the right thing, which is to say I stopped performing anger for the neighborhood and started doing the messy, unglamorous work of repair, calling lawyers and counselors and old friends who owed me favors, sitting in rooms that smelled like antiseptic while professionals explained options in words that made my head swim, and learning to be present in ways that didn't require me to be loud. Because loudness had gotten us nowhere, and quiet competence was what would keep her safe. And that quiet competence came with a cost. I had to swallow my pride every morning, to let go of the idea that a father's role is to punish and instead accept that sometimes a father's role is to be a steady hand while someone else finds their footing. And that humility felt like a wound that would not heal quickly, but it healed better than the alternative. Because the alternative was losing her to a public spectacle that would have left scars on both of us. And the ink that could have rewritten her life into ruin instead became the map that led us out of the maze. Because once you know the route someone has taken, you can block them, you can change the locks, you can call the right people and make the right moves so that the predators who feed on shame and secrecy find nothing to bite into. And doing that work taught me more about love than any Hallmark card ever could. It taught me that love is not a feeling you announce from a rooftop. It's a series of small, stubborn acts that add up over time. Like showing up at a hearing even when you want to be anywhere else. Like sitting through a counseling session and not interrupting. Like letting her make mistakes while being there to catch her when they become dangerous. And the ink on those papers became a ledger of accountability that we used to build a new foundation, not to punish, but to protect. And that shift changed the way I saw her and myself. Because I stopped seeing her as a child who needed to be controlled and started seeing her as a person who needed to be trusted to make hard choices with support. And that trust was fragile at first, like a glass you don't want to set down too hard, but we learned to handle it, to carry it together. And in the process, I learned to forgive in a way that didn't erase the past, but made it useful, like compost that feeds new growth. And forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant acknowledging the hurt and choosing to act differently going forward. And that choice was the real rewrite the ink had demanded. Because the papers had shown me what could be used to destroy us, and also what could be used to save us if we were brave enough to change. And bravery in this house looked like small things. Answering a call instead of letting it go to voicemail. Admitting when we were scared. Asking for help. Letting professionals do their jobs. And letting the community we had built around us be a net instead of a jury. And as those small acts accumulated, the old memories that had been stained by shame started to clear, like a fog lifting off a river, and I could remember the good without the ache of the bad swallowing it whole. And that was a miracle of a kind I hadn't expected. Because I had thought the only way to reclaim dignity was to make someone else feel small. But dignity returned when we chose to protect each other and to face the truth together. And the ink that had threatened to rewrite our story into tragedy ended up being the instrument that taught us how to write a different ending. One where mistakes are met with accountability and care, where secrets are brought into the light, not to humiliate, but to heal, and where a father learns that the strongest thing he can do is not to roar, but to stay. And in staying, he found a new kind of strength that didn't need an audience to be real. The choice between fire and mercy sat in my chest like a coin. I couldn't decide which side to spend. And that night, after the kitchen light had done its slow work of exposing things, I found myself pacing the living room with the papers folded in my pocket like a loaded thing, feeling every old instinct tug at me. The part of me that wanted to torch the world that had hurt my kid, to make the people who'd used her feel the same smallness she had tried to give me at dinner. But there was another part, quieter and older, that kept whispering that fire burns more than the thing you pointed at, and that mercy sometimes looks like the hardest, most dangerous kind of courage. I remember standing by the window watching the streetlights smear the night into long, forgiving lines and thinking about my own father, a man who taught me to stand up for myself, but never taught me how to stand up for someone else without breaking them. And I realized in a way that made my throat tight that being a father now meant learning a new grammar of strength, one where you could be fierce without being cruel, where you could protect without annihilating. And that realization felt like stepping off a cliff and finding a rope. The papers in my pocket were a map of possibilities. I could hand them to the right people and watch reputations burn. I could post them where everyone would see and let the shame do its work, or I could use them like a scalpel, precise and careful, to cut out the rot without taking the whole limb. And choosing the scalpel meant swallowing a pride that had been my armor for decades. I thought about the hiss at dinner, about the way her words had landed like a slap. And I won't lie, there were nights when the urge to make her feel small again rose up like bile. When I imagined the satisfaction of seeing her humbled in public, but every time that image came, it tasted like ash. And I remembered the little girl who used to hide my watch in the cookie jar and the way she used to call me dad, like it was a secret blessing. And I couldn't bring myself to trade that for a moment of vindication. So I did the thing that felt like betrayal to my old self. I chose mercy, but not the soft kind that ignores harm. I chose a mercy that was strategic, that had teeth and a plan, because mercy without backbone is just weakness, and I wasn't about to let weakness be the story of my house. I started by making a list, not of people to shame, but of people who could help. A lawyer who owed me a favor, a counselor who knew how to hold trauma without turning it into theater, a friend who worked in collections and could trace the money without making a scene. And I called them one by one in the dead hours when the world is honest and the phone doesn't feel like a stage. And I asked for help in a voice that didn't brag or beg, but simply stated facts, because facts are the currency that buys safety. While I moved, I watched my daughter like a man watching a fragile animal, careful not to startle her, offering help in small ways, dropping off groceries, sitting in the car while she smoked a cigarette she said she didn't want me to see, pretending not to notice the tremor in her hands when she signed forms. And those small acts were the scaffolding of mercy, the practical stuff that keeps someone from falling apart while you figure out the rest. There were moments when the old scripts tried to take over. Neighbors who said I should teach her a lesson, cousins who thought public shaming would be cathartic, and even a few friends who said revenge would be satisfying. But I learned to listen to those voices and then let them go, because satisfying someone else's appetite for drama would have cost me my daughter, and that was a price I wouldn't pay. The lawyer I called told me bluntly that exposure could ruin more than the person who'd hurt her. It could destroy future chances, jobs, relationships, and the kind of quiet dignity that lets a person rebuild. And hearing that made me feel both relieved and terrified, because I had to admit I didn't know what the right move was, only that I wanted to keep her whole enough to fight another day. So we made a plan that looked ugly and beautiful at the same time. We documented everything. We set boundaries. We filed for protection where it made sense, and we prepared for the fallout without inviting it, like building a shelter before the storm hits. Mercy in action meant sitting in a sterile office while a woman with kind eyes explained options. It meant paying for a security system and changing locks. It meant teaching my daughter how to answer a phone without giving away her location. And it meant me learning to be present without being performative, showing up at hearings, not to grandstand, but to sign papers and to be a witness to her courage. There were nights when I wanted to rage, to call the people who'd hurt her and tell them exactly what I thought. But I learned to channel that rage into something useful. Late-night research, calls to people who could help, quiet conversations with my daughter about safety plans and boundaries, and the slow, steady work of rebuilding trust. Choosing mercy didn't mean I forgave everything in a heartbeat. Forgiveness is a long road, and sometimes it never comes. But mercy meant I refused to let my anger be the architect of her future. It meant I would not be the man who used pain as a weapon. And that choice changed the way she looked at me. Slowly, like someone learning to trust a bridge after it had cracked. And it changed the way I saw myself, because I realized that the bravest thing I could do was to hold my tongue when it would have been easier to shout, to let the law and professionals do their jobs while I did the human work of being steady. There were setbacks, a rumor that spread like wildfire despite our best efforts, a night when she broke down and screamed that I didn't understand, and a day when the person who'd hurt her tried to gaslight us both. But each setback was met with the same quiet plan: document, protect, support, and that repetition built a rhythm that felt like armor. Mercy also meant teaching her to stand up for herself in ways that didn't require me to fight her battles, to give her tools, and then step back while she used them. And watching her do that was like watching a sunrise after a long, dark night. It was messy and imperfect and full of small victories that felt enormous. In the end, the choice between fire and mercy wasn't a single moment, but 1,000 small decisions that added up to a life saved from spectacle. And when the dust settled and the papers that could have ruined her life were used instead to build a case that protected her, I felt something like relief and something like grief at the same time. Grief for the innocence lost, relief that we had chosen a path that kept her whole. And I learned that mercy is not a surrender, but a strategy, a way to be fierce without being cruel, and that choosing it doesn't make you soft. It makes you dangerous in a better way. Dangerous to the things that would harm your people, because you are willing to be patient, to plan, and to love without needing the applause of strangers. The conversations that followed felt like walking through a house after an earthquake. Every sentence a cracked tile you had to step around or else fall through. And I learned fast that words could be weapons or scaffolding, depending on how you use them. After the papers, after the lawyer and the locks and the nights of pacing, we started talking in ways we never had. Raw, messy, honest. And it was brutal and beautiful all at once. Because for the first time in a long time, we were not pretending. Everything was fine. We were naming the rot and deciding whether to cut it out or let it fester. And that naming hurt like hell. I remember the first real conversation we had. Not the clipped, defensive stuff at dinner, but the one where she sat across from me at the table and let the silence sit between us until it stopped being an enemy and became a space to breathe. And she told me things that made my stomach drop and my heart rearrange itself. Admissions that tasted like shame, confessions that were more about fear than malice, and a kind of weary honesty that made me want to both hold her and shake her awake. I didn't yell. Yelling felt cheap and easy, and I had learned that cheap victories leave you hollow. So I listened, and listening was harder than I thought, because it meant letting her speak without interrupting with my own hurt, without turning the conversation into a courtroom where I was both judge and executioner. We talked about the hiss at dinner, about how words can cut deeper than fists, about how humiliation is a currency some people spend to feel powerful, and she told me why she had pushed me away, because she thought she was protecting me from shame, because she was ashamed of what she'd gotten into, because she didn't want my image of her to be ruined by the mess she was in. And hearing that made me feel like a man who had been punched in the gut and then offered a hand to help him up. The first few conversations were like pulling splinters, small, sharp, and they bled for a while, but each one removed something that would have infected the wound if left alone. We set rules for how to talk. No accusations that were just arrows, no lectures that were just noise, no secrets that would be used as ammunition later. We agreed to call things by their names and to stop pretending that silence was protection. That agreement was fragile at first, like a promise made on a shaky bridge, but we kept it because we both wanted something that felt like repair rather than revenge. I learned to ask questions that didn't sound like traps. How are you sleeping? Who are you talking to? What do you need? And she learned to answer without armor, to say I messed up or I'm scared and mean it without the reflex to hide. Those small shifts changed the tenor of our house. Conversations that used to be performances for the neighborhood turned into real exchanges where we traded fear for facts and shame for plans. We started to rehearse hard things. How to set boundaries with people who had hurt her, how to answer nosy relatives without giving them the power to judge, how to handle a call in the middle of the night without panicking. We practiced scripts for safety, and the practice made the scripts less robotic and more like muscle memory you could rely on when your hands were shaking. There were nights when the talking broke us open again, when she would cry and say she hated herself, when I would confess that I had wanted to make her feel small, when old resentments rose like ghosts and tried to take over the room. But those nights, as awful as they were, also taught us how to hold each other through the worst parts. We learned to say I'm sorry in ways that meant something. Not the quick I'm sorry that patches over things, but the kind that names what you did and what you'll do differently. I apologized for not seeing, for letting my pride get in the way, for almost choosing spectacle over safety, and she apologized for the lies and the hiding and for the hiss that had cut me so deep. Apologies didn't erase the past, but they made a path forward. Conversations also forced us to reckon with the people around us. Friends who wanted to help but didn't know how. Neighbors who whispered like vultures. Relatives who thought punishment was the only medicine. And we had to learn to navigate that noise without letting it steer us. We practiced responses. Thank you for your concern. We're handling it. Please respect our privacy. Saying those things out loud felt like building a fence around our fragile work. I had to teach myself to be patient with people who didn't understand why I wouldn't burn everything down, and she had to teach herself to accept help without feeling like she was admitting defeat. The hardest conversations were the ones about trust, how to rebuild it, how to measure it, how to know when it's safe to lean in again. Trust isn't a light switch. It's a slow accumulation of small, consistent acts, and we started keeping a ledger of those acts in our heads. She answered a call without panicking. I didn't bring up the past in front of company. She showed up for a counseling session. I sat quietly while she spoke to a lawyer. Each act was a deposit, and slowly the account grew. We also had to talk about boundaries with the people who had hurt her. What was acceptable contact? What wasn't? When to call the police? When to block numbers? And those conversations were tactical and cold and necessary. They were the kind of adult talk that doesn't feel romantic, but keeps you alive. I found myself learning new vocabulary: restraining orders, cease and desist, evidence preservation, and I learned to say those words without letting them become weapons. The goal was never to humiliate anyone. It was to make sure the people who preyed on shame couldn't find purchase in our lives again. Conversations that break can also build empathy in strange ways. I started to see her not as the kid who had hissed at me, but as a person who had been cornered by fear and had made choices to survive. And seeing that didn't excuse everything, but it changed the way I held my anger. I stopped wanting to punish and started wanting to protect. And that shift made me softer in ways that felt dangerous at first, but turned out to be the only thing that kept us from becoming monsters to each other. We talked about the future too, about what safety looked like in practical terms, about jobs and therapy, and the slow work of rebuilding credit and reputation, about how to tell the story to people who needed to know without turning it into a spectacle. Those conversations were full of logistics and small humiliations and the kind of boring, steady work that actually heals. Filling out forms, making calls, showing up at appointments, doing the paperwork that makes a life legal and safe again. It was not glamorous, but it was real. And through all of it, the house changed. The dinner table stopped being a stage for performance and became a place where we could say hard things and still eat, where we could argue and then pass the salt and mean it when we said I love you. The hiss didn't disappear from my memory, but it lost its power to define us. Conversations that break and build taught me that being a father isn't about being right. It's about being present, about learning to listen when your instinct is to roar, about choosing repair over revenge even when revenge feels like a quick fix. They taught me that words can wound, but they can also stitch, and that the work of stitching is slow and requires humility and stubbornness in equal measure. If I had to give one piece of advice to anyone watching, if you find yourself on the edge of a conversation that could either destroy or save a relationship, lean toward the one that builds. It won't be easy. It will cost you pride and comfort and sometimes sleep. But the alternative is a spectacle that leaves everyone poorer. We chose to talk, to break, and to build. And in the rubble we found a foundation we could stand on. Shaky at first, sure now. Because it was built out of truth and small acts of courage rather than the cheap thrill of making someone else small. The lawyer's letter felt like a verdict before the trial, a thin envelope with a stamp that made my hands sweat. And when I slid it open at the kitchen table, the words inside were clinical and cold, and somehow more terrifying than the hiss at dinner, because this was official, this was paper with teeth. And it meant the mess had moved from whispers into rooms with fluorescent lights and forms to sign. I remember the way the paper trembled between my fingers like it knew it was about to change everything. And I remember thinking that the waiting room would be the place where our private life met the public system and either got fixed or shredded. So I drove her there like a man carrying a secret in his chest, the car radio off because noise felt like betrayal. And we sat in the lobby with our hands folded like two people pretending we were fine. And the waiting room smelled like old coffee and disinfectant and the kind of nervous energy that makes your throat tight. And I watched her. Watched the clock like it was a metronome counting down to a verdict. And in that watching, I felt every second of the last weeks press into me. The hiss, the papers, the nights of pacing, the calls to lawyers and friends, and the way my pride had been chipped away until I could see the raw wood underneath. And I realized that being a father in this moment wasn't about being loud or right. It was about being present in the small, ugly places where real work gets done. So I kept my mouth shut and let her lead the conversation when the lawyer finally called us in, because she needed to speak for herself and I needed to learn how to listen without trying to fix everything with a single blow. And the lawyer was a woman with tired eyes and a voice that didn't do drama. She did facts, and facts are the kind of thing that can save you if you treat them like tools instead of weapons, and she laid out options like a mechanic listing parts, restraining orders, evidence preservation, cease and desist, letters, and a plan to trace the money and cut off the routes that had been feeding the mess. And as she spoke, I felt both relief and a new kind of fear, because relief meant we had a path, and fear meant the path would be long and ugly, and would require us to be brave in ways that didn't look like heroics on a movie screen. It looked like paperwork and patience and showing up to hearings and answering the same questions until your voice went hoarse. And I thought about how easy it would have been to take the other route, to post the papers and watch the world react, to let the hiss be avenged in public. But the lawyer's steady voice reminded me that public spectacle eats people alive and leaves nothing but ash. So we chose the slow, surgical route, and that choice felt like both a mercy and a sentence, because it meant we had to live with the truth in daylight and not hide behind righteous fury. And the waiting room became our crucible, where we learned to be small and steady, instead of loud and destructive. While the lawyer worked the angles, I did the human work. I sat in the car while she made calls. I held her when she cried in the parking lot like a woman who had been carrying a boulder for too long. And I learned to be useful in ways that didn't require me to be the loudest voice in the room. I learned to be the one who remembered appointments, who brought snacks, who sat through the boring parts, and kept my face calm when the world tried to make us into a spectacle. And that was harder than I thought, because my old instincts wanted to roar and make the problem go away. But roaring would have made the problem worse. So I swallowed the roar and learned to be a steady presence. And that steadiness mattered in the waiting room, where other people sat with their own private disasters, and you could feel the air thick with stories that had no easy endings. There were moments of absurdity too, like when the receptionist mispronounced our names, and I wanted to correct her just to feel in control, or when a man in a suit tried to give me advice about teaching her a lesson, and I had to bite my tongue so hard it hurt. Because the waiting room is full of people who think they know the right thing to do, but don't know the cost of their words. And I learned to let those voices pass like bad weather, to focus on the work at hand, which was to protect my daughter and to keep her whole enough to fight another day. The lawyer's letter also forced us to reckon with the neighbors and the relatives who wanted to be part of the drama. Some offered help, some offered judgment, and we had to decide who to let in and who to keep at arm's length. And that was a lesson in itself, because family can be a net or a noose depending on how you use it. And we started to build a small circle of people who would be practical and quiet. An aunt who could watch the house for a night, a friend who could drive her to appointments, a counselor who didn't flinch at the ugly parts. And those people became our waiting room allies, the ones who sat with us in the silence and didn't demand a spectacle. The legal process was slow and bureaucratic and full of forms that made me feel like I was learning a new language. Affidavits, subpoenas, service of process. And I learned to say those words without letting them become weapons, because the goal was not to humiliate, but to create a legal barrier between her and the people who would use shame as a tool. And that barrier required patience and documentation and a willingness to relive the worst nights in sterile rooms with people who took notes. And that reliving was brutal, but it was also a kind of cleansing, because it turned chaos into a record, and records can be used to protect instead of punish. There were nights when the waiting room felt like a metaphor for our lives, sitting in limbo, watching the clock, hoping for a call that would change everything. And there were nights when it felt like a sanctuary, a place where we could be honest without the pressure of neighbors or the glare of social media. And in those nights, I learned to appreciate the small mercies. A lawyer who actually listened, a clerk who filed our papers without judgment, a counselor who gave us tools instead of platitudes, and my daughter, who in the waiting room learned to speak up for herself in ways that made me proud and scared at the same time. Because independence is a double-edged sword, and I had to let her use it even when it meant stepping back and letting professionals do their jobs. The lawyer's letter had been the spark that lit the fuse, but the waiting room was where the real work happened. The slow, tedious, necessary work of turning a private mess into a public record that could protect rather than destroy. And as we sat there day after day, I watched my daughter change from someone who hissed at me across a table into someone who could look a stranger in the eye and say, "This happened to me." And that admission was both a wound and a relief, because naming the thing takes power away from it. And the waiting room taught us how to name without spectacle. In the end, the letter and the waiting room didn't give us a neat ending. They gave us a process, and processes are messy and imperfect and full of setbacks. But they also give you a path, and a path is better than a cliff. And as we left the courthouse that day with papers in hand and a plan in place, I felt something like exhaustion and something like a fragile hope. Because the waiting room had taught me that being a father isn't about grand gestures. It's about the small, steady acts that keep someone alive long enough to rebuild. And that lesson was worth every minute of the sterile chairs and the ticking clocks. Hashtag, 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 hashtag scars that teach us how to stay. The scars in this house are not the kind you see at first glance. They live in the corners of conversations, in the way the couch sags where we used to sit close, in the faint groove on the kitchen table where a coffee mug has been dragged 1,000 times. And I learned that scars teach you how to stay if you let them. So I started paying attention to the marks instead of pretending they weren't there. Because pretending had gotten us into this mess in the first place, and staying felt like a decision I had to make every morning when I woke up with the taste of that hiss still in my mouth. Some mornings I wanted to run, to get in the car and drive until the radio drowned out the memory. But the scars kept me anchored, like a rope tied to something that mattered, and I learned to read them like a map of what we'd been through and what we still had to fix. And that reading was brutal and honest, and sometimes it made me want to puke, because every scar told a story of a night I hadn't been there, of a call I hadn't answered, of a pride that had been louder than my love. But it also told stories of small mercies, of the time I sat up with her when she couldn't sleep, of the night I drove her to a hearing and waited in the car with my hands clenched until she came out with a paper that meant safety, of the stupid jokes we used to trade that still made her roll her eyes and then laugh. And those little things were the stitches that held us together when everything else felt like it might fall apart. And staying meant tending to those stitches even when it was ugly, even when the temptation to make someone pay for what they'd done was a bright, easy flame in my chest. Because revenge is a quick high and a long hangover. And I had seen enough hangovers to know I didn't want that for us. So I chose the slow, boring work of repair, which is where the real courage lives. I started to treat the scars like teachers. When I saw her flinch at a loud voice, I learned to lower mine. When she clammed up about money, I learned to ask gently and then help without making it a sermon. When she snapped at me for something small, I remembered the nights she had been brave in court, and I swallowed the urge to snap back. Because staying is not about being a doormat. It's about being steady, about being the kind of person who can hold both the hurt and the hope without letting either tip the scale into something destructive. And that balance is a muscle you build by doing the small, unglamorous things over and over until they become who you are. There were days when the scars felt like a ledger of failures, and I wanted to burn the whole damn book, to erase the past with a public spectacle that would make me feel big for 5 minutes. But then I'd catch a glimpse of her in the hallway, hair in a messy bun, face raw from crying, but eyes that still had that stubborn spark. And I'd remember why I had to be better than my worst instinct. Because being a father isn't about winning arguments. It's about being the person your kid can come home to when the world has chewed them up, and that responsibility is heavier than any pride I ever carried. So I learned to carry it without making it a show. The scars taught me to listen for the small alarms. A missed call that used to be nothing now made me check in. A text that used to be casual now got a follow-up. A friend who used to be welcome now got a background check. Not because I wanted to control her, but because I wanted to make sure the people around her weren't the ones who would leave new marks. And that protective instinct changed the way I moved through the world. I became less performative and more practical, less about grand gestures and more about the quiet logistics that keep someone safe. Changing locks, setting up two-factor authentication on accounts, teaching her to keep receipts and screenshots, sitting with her while she made a safety plan and then practicing it until it felt like muscle memory. Because when fear hits, you don't have time to invent a plan. You need something you can do with your hands while your brain is shaking. The work of staying also meant owning my mistakes out loud, which is a humbling kind of medicine. I told her I was sorry for not seeing, for letting my ego get in the way, for almost choosing spectacle over safety, and I meant it in a way that wasn't performative. My apologies came with actions. I stopped bringing up the past in front of company. I stopped using the papers as leverage in arguments. I stopped pretending that being right was more important than being present, and those changes didn't fix everything overnight, but they made a space where trust could grow again, slow and stubborn like grass through concrete. There were nights when the scars ached, when memories would flare up and I'd wake sweating, replaying the hiss like a broken record. And in those nights, I learned to be gentle with myself too, because staying doesn't mean you have to be unbreakable. It means you have to be willing to be repaired, to go to therapy, to talk to friends who won't judge, to let the weight of what happened be shared instead of carried alone. And that sharing made the load lighter in ways I hadn't expected. The neighborhood still had opinions. People who thought I should have taught her a lesson. People who whispered that I was soft. But their words were like wind against a window. They made noise, but they didn't change the foundation we were rebuilding. And I learned to let their judgments slide off like rain. Because the only verdict that mattered was the one between me and my daughter, and we were the ones doing the work. Staying also meant celebrating the small wins like they were holidays. The first time she slept through the night without waking in a panic. The day she went back to work and didn't call me every hour. The afternoon she laughed at a dumb movie and didn't look over her shoulder afterward. And those wins were tiny and messy and sometimes followed by setbacks. But they were proof that the stitches were holding. I started to see scars differently. Not as proof of failure, but as evidence of survival. And survival is not a passive thing. It's active and loud in its own quiet way. It's the daily choice to show up, to make coffee, to sit through a counseling session, to answer a text at 2 in the morning, to drive across town for a court date, to hold a hand when the shaking starts. And those acts add up to a life that can be trusted again. The hardest lesson the scars taught me was that staying doesn't guarantee a neat ending. Sometimes people leave. Sometimes things break beyond repair, and you have to be ready for that grief too. But staying gives you the dignity of knowing you tried, that you chose love over spectacle, and that matters when the world tries to reduce everything to a headline. Because headlines don't hold hands, or make safety plans, or sit through the boring paperwork that keeps people alive. And if I had to choose between a headline and a life, I'd choose the life every time. So I learned to live with the marks, to trace them with my thumb like a promise, to let them remind me of what we had lost and what we were building. And in that tracing, I found a stubborn hope that felt like a muscle, calloused, a little ugly, but strong enough to carry us forward. And that hope kept me in the house when leaving would have been easier. And in the end, the scars didn't make us weaker. They taught us how to stay. That night, the house learned to breathe again like it had been holding its breath for years and finally let out a long, shaky exhale. And I remember standing in the doorway watching the light move across the floor like a slow apology, thinking about how small things add up until they either break you or make you. And in our case, they made us in a way I hadn't expected. The day had been full of errands and court dates, and the kind of bureaucratic cruelty that strips dignity in neat, paper-cut edges. And we came home exhausted in a way that felt like a bruise. But there was something different in the air, less of the electric tension that had been humming between us and more of a tired, honest quiet that felt like the first truce after a long fight. And she was in the kitchen making soup like she used to when she was a kid and thought soup could fix anything. And the smell hit me like a memory, and I realized how much of our life had been reduced to logistics and survival, and how little of it had been about the dumb, human stuff that actually keeps you alive. Shared jokes, stupid playlists, the way someone knows exactly how you like your coffee. And that night we let some of that back in, not all at once, but in small, ridiculous ways that felt like miracles because they were so ordinary. She burned the garlic and swore in a voice that made me laugh despite myself. and the laugh was a small, dangerous thing because it meant we were risking softness again, and softness had felt like a liability for so long that letting it in felt like treason against the armor we'd built. But it was the right kind of treason, the kind that saves people instead of destroying them. And we sat at the table with bowls between us, and the hiss at dinner felt like a ghost in the corner, present but no longer the thing that defined the room. And we talked about nothing and everything, about a stupid show she wanted to binge, about the neighbor's dog that still barked at midnight, about the way the city lights looked from the bridge, and those small, stupid topics were scaffolding for something bigger. Trust rebuilding itself in the quiet, like mortar setting between bricks, and I felt my chest unclench in a way I hadn't thought possible, like a knot finally loosening after years of being knotted. And when she told me a story about a barista who had messed up her order and she laughed at the memory, I felt a fierce, ridiculous pride that she could laugh again, that she could let herself be small and human and not just a headline or a case file. And I realized that the house had been holding its breath not because it was broken, but because we had been holding our breath, waiting for permission to be ordinary again. And that permission had to come from us. After dinner, we moved to the couch, and the TV was on, but we weren't watching it. We were watching each other in the way people do when they're learning to trust a bridge after it cracked. Careful, tentative, testing the planks. She leaned her head on my shoulder like she used to when she was little, and I felt the old reflex to fix everything rise up and then die, because fixing isn't always what someone needs. Sometimes they need a hand that doesn't try to rearrange the world but simply holds it, steady while they find their footing. And so I held her and let the silence be a thing that healed instead of a thing that punished. And in that holding, I felt the house breathe with us, like the walls had been waiting for this small, steady rhythm to return. We talked about the future in a way that wasn't full of grand promises, but of practical steps. Therapy appointments, a plan for work, a savings account that wasn't a fantasy, and a list of people to call if things got bad again. And making those lists felt like armor that wasn't about spectacle, but about survival. And the act of planning together made us partners in a way that had been missing when secrecy and shame had been the currency of our lives. And partnership is a quiet, stubborn thing that shows up in the small details. Who remembers to refill the prescription? Who texts when a meeting runs late? Who sits through the boring parts of recovery without making it into a performance? And those details started to stitch us back together. Later, she went to the window and opened it a crack, and the night air came in cool and honest. And I watched the curtains move like a slow, forgiving hand and thought about how much of our life had been lived behind closed windows, hiding from judgment and gossip and the bright, hungry light of other people's opinions. And opening that window felt like a small rebellion against shame, like saying we will live in daylight even if the sun shows our scars, because scars are proof of survival and not something to be hidden forever. We made a playlist of songs that meant nothing and everything, old tracks that had been the soundtrack to better days and new ones that felt like a promise. And we danced in the kitchen like idiots, two grown people who had been through too much to care about looking cool. And the clumsy steps and the laughter were a kind of therapy that didn't require a couch or a copay. And when she bumped into me and said sorry in a voice that was half apology and half gratitude, I felt something like a benediction, like we had been given a second chance to be ordinary, and we were taking it with both hands. The night also held hard moments, tears that came without warning, a panic attack that made us both breathe like we were learning a new language, a flash of anger when a memory hit too sharp. But those moments were part of the work, not derailments, and we learned to meet them with tools instead of theatrics. Grounding exercises, a call to a counselor, a plan to sleep in separate rooms when the nightmares came too loud. And those practicalities felt like love in a way that was ugly and beautiful. Because love is not always pretty. Sometimes it's a list of things you do when you are terrified, and you keep doing them anyway. By midnight, the house felt different, less like a stage where we performed for the world and more like a shelter where we could be messy and real. And I walked through the rooms and noticed small things. A mug left on the counter, a jacket draped over a chair, a note on the fridge that said, "Call me," in handwriting that looked like hers. And those small domestic traces were like breadcrumbs leading me back to a life that had been interrupted but not erased. And I felt a fierce gratitude that we had chosen to stay and to do the work instead of choosing spectacle and ruin. When we finally went to bed, the sheets felt like a truce and sleep came like a gift. And in the dark, I thought about how the house had learned to breathe again, not because of one big heroic act, but because of 1,000 small, stubborn choices. Choosing mercy over fire, choosing presence over pride, choosing to plan instead of perform, choosing to laugh when it would have been easier to rage, and those choices added up to a rhythm that kept us alive. And as I drifted off, I felt the steady, ordinary sound of the house breathing with us, and I knew that the work wasn't over, that there would be setbacks and nights when the hiss would echo in my head. But for the first time in a long time, I believed we could keep going, that the house could be a place of safety and not a stage, and that belief felt like oxygen. The last chapter isn't an ending so much as a reckoning, and I sit here with the papers closed but not forgotten, feeling like a man who has learned that love and revenge are cousins who show up at the same funeral, and you have to choose which one to bury. I used to think strength was a loud thing, a fist, a headline, but the slow months taught me otherwise. Strength is the quiet that sits with someone while they vomit their shame, the steady hand that doesn't flinch when the world wants to point and laugh. And so I chose love not because it was easy, but because it was the only thing that could keep her breathing. The hiss at dinner still echoes in my head like a scratched record, but it no longer tells the whole story. It is a single note in a song that has learned to play again. We rebuilt on the small things. Coffee made without comment, a text that says, "I'm okay," and means it. A counselor's office where we learn to name the monsters and not let them name us. I learned to be useful instead of theatrical, to call people who could help without making a scene, to change locks and passwords, and to teach her how to answer a phone without giving away her life. Those acts are not glamorous, but they are the scaffolding of survival. And I learned that mercy can be tactical, that forgiveness is not a free pass, but a decision to stop using pain as a weapon. There were nights I wanted to burn the world down, to make the people who hurt her feel small, to watch them squirm under the light. But revenge is a mirror that only reflects your own ugliness, and I refused to be that man. Instead, I learned to be patient, to let the law do its work while I did mine, which was to be present, to hold space, to make sure she had a roof and a plan, and people who would show up without spectacle. The house changed. The rooms that had been stages for performance became shelters, and the dinner table stopped being an arena and became a place where we could say hard things and still pass the salt. People in the neighborhood had opinions, of course, and some of them wanted blood, but their voices were wind against a window. They made noise but didn't change the work we were doing. I learned to let judgment slide off like rain, to focus on the ledger that mattered, small acts of care that added up. We kept the papers locked away, not as trophies but as tools, evidence used to build a shield instead of a sword, and that choice saved her from a public spectacle that would have eaten her alive. There were setbacks, rumors that spread, a night when she broke down and screamed that I didn't understand, a call that made her flinch, and days when the past felt like a shadow at the door. But we learned to meet setbacks with plans, with grounding exercises, with a counselor's number on speed dial, with a list of people who would show up without asking for a spectacle. Love in this house became a verb, a set of actions that looked boring but were lethal to the things that prey on shame. Documentation, boundaries, therapy, and the stubborn refusal to let humiliation be the currency of our lives. I watched her learn to stand in rooms without shrinking, to answer questions without panic, to make plans and keep them, and each small victory felt like a sunrise after a long night. My pride was bruised, sure, but it softened into something better, humility that made room for repair. I stopped measuring myself by how loudly I could roar and started measuring by how steady my hands were when she needed them. The community we built around us was small and practical. An aunt who could watch the house, a friend who could drive her to appointments, a counselor who didn't flinch, And those people were the net that caught us when the world tried to drop us. There were nights I woke and replayed the hiss and felt the old urge to punish. But then I'd see her sleeping and remember the little girl who used to fall asleep on my chest, and the urge would pass, replaced by a fierce tenderness that surprised me. Tenderness is not weakness. It's a weapon that heals when used. Right, and I learned to wield it with care. We didn't get a fairy tale ending. There was no neat bow, no applause, but there was a slow reckoning that taught us how to live with the truth, and that was enough to keep us moving. If you're watching and you think the easy road is to make someone small, don't take it. The cheap thrill of revenge will leave you hollow, and the people you love will be the ones who pay. Choose the slow work instead. Show up, document, set boundaries, call the right people, and be steady. It won't be glamorous, but it will keep someone alive. In the end, I learned that love over revenge is not a surrender, but a strategy, and strategy wins when fury fades. We are still here, messy and scarred, but breathing, and that breathing is a kind of victory, small and stubborn, and I'll take it over a headline any day. So I close this chapter not with a flourish, but with a promise. To stay, to choose mercy when it protects, to be the kind of man who holds steady when the world wants to watch you burn, and to teach my daughter that dignity is not given by spectacle, but earned in the quiet work of staying. And if that sounds small to some, let them have their noise. We will keep.